The trial. The death sentence had been passed by the Council of the Jews, and now all that remained to be done was to obtain the official approval of their Roman ruler. A great company of people led Jesus to Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, for final judgment. High priests and chief Pharisees took up the lead. Behind them came the false witnesses who had spoken against him, various hirelings who had been persuaded to shout abuse against the man whom others called King of the Jews, and numbers of people who had little understanding of what was happening but had been attracted by the crowd. In the midst of all was Jesus, still bound and pushed along by soldiers who did not care what he had done but knew that he must not escape. Pontius Pilate came out into the courtyard of his palace and stared at the multitude. There were high priests there, he saw, and elders of the people, and many others whom he did not know. In the midst of all there stood a man who clearly was their prisoner. The man's wrists were tightly tied together. His simple robe was soiled, and he had evidently been beaten without mercy. Yet he seemed serene and unafraid. Early though it was, Pilate was ready to listen to their case. It must surely be important, or they would not have come at this hour, least of all with their high priests in the lead, looking both outraged and triumphant. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" asked Pilate. "He is an evildoer," Caiaphas and Annas answered him, "or we would not have brought him to you. He has been corrupting our nation, forbidding people to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he is Christ, King of the Jews." Now, in saying this, they were not bringing up their own charge of blasphemy, for they knew that Pontius Pilate had no interest in their religious laws. But they were sure he would be interested in a Jew who claimed to be a king and refused the tribute to Caesar, for this was treason against the Roman rulers. Yet they had not read Pilate as accurately as they thought. The Roman ruler caught the phrase, "King of the Jews," and decided at once that this was a Jewish religious question and therefore none of his concern. "Then try him yourselves," said Pilate, "and judge him according to your own law." "We have tried him," they answered, "but we have no authority to put any man to death." Pilate knew that very well, but he had not expected them to ask the death sentence. He looked again at the captive Jesus and saw a most unlikely-looking king and a most unlikely-looking criminal. And as he looked, the chief priests and the elders shouted accusations against the prisoner, accusing him of many things. Yet the prisoner himself said nothing. Pilate found this very strange, for he had seen many prisoners before, and they had always been vigorous in their own defense. "Do you have no answer for them?" Pilate said to Jesus. "Do you not hear how many things they charge you with?" But Jesus made no answer to any of the accusations. He only stood there, dignified and calm. So calm that Pilate marveled greatly, turned away, and went back into his palace, for he knew nothing of this prisoner, and realized he would find out nothing while the mob was screaming accusations in the courtyard. From the judgment hall of his palace, he there sent for Jesus. Jesus came in and stood before him, still bound, still unafraid. And Pilate the governor asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" "Do you ask me this because you think it yourself?" said Jesus. "Or have others told you this about me?" "Am I a Jew?" answered Pilate. "Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? Do they accuse you rightly?" For he wanted to know if Jesus really claimed to be their king. "My kingdom is not of this world," Jesus answered. "If it were, my men would have fought to keep me from being delivered into the hands of the Jews. No, my kingdom is not here on earth." "Then you are a king?" said Pilate. "You say rightly, I am a king," Jesus answered. "It was for this that I was born, and for this that I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth listens to my voice." Pilate stared at him. "What is truth?" he asked. With these words he arose and strode out into the courtyard once again to face the Jews. He had heard all he needed to hear. Jesus had said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And to Pilate, that did not sound like treason against the Roman emperor. "I find no fault in this man," he said. The priests were thunderstruck that Pilate should have found Jesus innocent. Mutterings broke out in the crowd they had gathered to lend weight to their false cause, and the priests themselves became increasingly urgent in their demands. "He is stirring up the people," they cried fiercely. "He has been teaching his radical doctrines throughout all Judea, beginning in Galilee, going all over the countryside, even coming here to Jerusalem." "Oh," said Pilate, "Galilee? Is this man a Galilean?" "Yes. He is from Nazareth." "Ah." Pilate was glad to hear it. The whole affair was becoming a nuisance to him. If this Jesus was a Galilean, he came under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod could take care of his own. So Pilate sent Jesus and his accusers to Herod Antipas, who also happened to be in Jerusalem at that time because of the festival. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had long been interested in seeing this man. He had lost his earlier desire to send out soldiers to seize him, for by all accounts the man Jesus was not John the Baptist risen again, nor had he spoken out against Herod, as had John. Nevertheless, Herod had heard many extraordinary things about the Nazarene, and he was most anxious to see some miracle performed by him. Therefore he greeted Jesus with enthusiasm, though without cordiality, and questioned him at length. But Jesus gave no answer to Herod's questions, nor any sign of his miraculous powers. Herod soon tired of him. This was poor sport indeed. He let the chief priests and scribes have their turn to speak, and they were only too willing. Vehemently they accused Jesus of inciting rebellion among the people, of refusing to pay tribute to Caesar, of claiming to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews. But Herod was not interested. He had only wanted to see signs, and he had seen none. Certainly he could see no evidence of treason, and obviously the man was no threat, either to the Romans or to Herod himself. The only thing that caught the Tetrarch's interest was that this quiet man before him could claim to be the King of Israel or the King of the Jews. And that in itself was Judea's problem, not Herod's. Still, it was an amusing thought, and Herod smiled. A king, was he? And Herod laughed as he struck upon an idea that entertained him greatly. At least he would have some enjoyment from all this. "Bring robes," he ordered his palace guards. "If this man is a king, then let him look like a king." So they dressed Jesus mockingly in regal robes, laughing at their own cleverness. And they ridiculed him as he stood there in the finery they had forced upon him. But soon they tired of this, too, for Jesus seemed untouched by their mockery, and they stopped their jeering and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate was not pleased to see the Jews returning with their captive. He called together the chief priests and the leading members of the council, and all the people who had demanded that he pronounce sentence upon Jesus. "You brought this man to me," he said, "as one who has misled the people with false claims. I have examined him before you, and have not found him guilty of any of the things of which you have accused him. Neither has Herod found him guilty, for he sent him back to us. This man has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." The crowd stirred restlessly. Flogging with a metal-tipped scourge was a terrible punishment, but it was not death, and they wanted Jesus dead. Certainly they did not want to have him released. Now at the time of the festival it was customary for the governor to release to the people any prisoner they chose. And at this particular time, a notable prisoner named Barabbas was lying bound in a dungeon. Barabbas was a revolutionary who had stirred rebellion among the people, in addition to being a robber and a murderer. And while Pilate himself definitely preferred to have such a man languishing in jail, the people themselves had no great interest in Barabbas either in prison or out, until Pilate now gave them a choice. "Shall I then release the King of the Jews in accordance with your custom?" Pilate asked. "Or whom would you have me release? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" He hoped that the crowd would call for Jesus, for he knew that the high priests had delivered Jesus to him out of envy, and he did not wish to condemn the Nazarene to death. But the mob gathered by the priests and Pharisees cried out together, "Not this man! Away with Jesus! Release not him, but Barabbas!" Pilate was deeply disturbed by their answer, and while he sat there on the judgment seat hesitating, he received a message from his wife. It said, "Have nothing to do with harming that good man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." At this, Pilate was even more worried than before. He mulled the problem over in his mind. Even while he was doing so, the chief priests and elders were arousing the multitude to cry out for Barabbas so that Jesus might be destroyed. In spite of the rising tumult, Pilate asked again, "Which of the two would you have me release?" "Barabbas, Barabbas," they shouted back. "Then what would you have me do to Jesus, who is called Christ?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" the people screamed. "Why? What evil has he done?" asked Pilate. "I have found nothing in him to warrant his death. I will therefore chastise him and release him." "No, crucify him! Crucify him!" screamed the crowd. "Give us Barabbas instead." But Pilate sent for his guard so that Jesus might be flogged, for he thought that once the crowd saw the dreadful punishment inflicted upon Jesus, they would relent and no longer demand his death. Pilate's soldiers flogged Jesus brutally. When they had done, they led him into the common hall and gathered about him with glee upon their faces. They stripped him of his tunic and dressed him in a purple robe, such as a very great king might wear. And they wove a wreath of thorns and placed it on his head as if it were a crown. And they thrust a tall reed into his hand as if it were a scepter. Then they bowed low and knelt before him as though in worship of a mighty king. "Hail, King of the Jews," they mocked. When they had had enough of this, they took the sturdy reed and struck him with it, and they spat upon him. Then they led him back to Pilate. Pilate once again went out into the courtyard and said to the waiting priests and multitude, "Behold, I bring him out to you so that you may know that I find no fault in him." Surely now, he thought, the council and the people would have had enough. Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate pointed at him. Jesus was gaunt and bleeding, a travesty of a king in his mock-regal raiment. But still he stood upright and moved with quiet dignity. "Behold the man," said Pilate. Whipped into yet greater frenzy by the high priests and their officers, the crowd cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "Take him and crucify him yourselves, then," Pilate said, frightened by their ferocity. "I can find no crime in him." But the Jews, under Roman law, were not permitted to execute a man themselves. The Romans had to do it for them. And it was clear to the high priests and the Pharisees that Pilate was still trying to avoid pronouncing an official sentence. "We have a law," the Pharisees shouted, "and by our law he deserves death for declaring himself to be the Son of God." The crowd roared again, and this time there was a note of menace in their cries. Pilate, hearing it, became even more afraid. He led Jesus to one side and asked him almost desperately, "What are you?" But Jesus made no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" said Pilate. "Do you not know that it is my power to release you or have you crucified?" "You have no power against me that is not given to you from above," Jesus answered. "The man who betrayed me to you has committed the greater sin." At this, Pilate tried again to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you free this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who pretends to be a king commits treason against Caesar." "Then shall I crucify your king?" said Pilate. "He is not our king," the high priests shouted back. "We have no king but Caesar. Are you not Caesar's friend?" By now their threat was obvious, and Pilate really was afraid. If what they were saying came to Caesar's ears, he himself would be in jeopardy. Already it looked as though a riot might develop, and this in itself would be enough to endanger his position. He therefore sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd. "I am innocent of the blood of this just man," he said. "You must see to it yourselves." Then all the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and upon our children." Pilate pronounced sentence. He released Barabbas to them, and he called his soldiers to give them their instructions. When they had finished mocking Jesus in his purple robe, they took it off and dressed him once again in his own simple garment. Then, leaving the crown of thorns upon his head, they led him away from the governor's palace to be crucified. And Pilate, having washed his hands of the whole affair, left them to it. Now Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Jesus, was hovering on the fringes of the crowd as it neared the city gate, and soon discovered that Jesus had been condemned to death by crucifixion. Suddenly he was stricken with terrible remorse for the treacherous thing he had done. With a greatly troubled heart, he went back to the chief priests and elders with his 30 pieces of silver. "I have sinned," he said. "I have betrayed an innocent man." They looked at him with scorn. "What is that to us?" they said. "That is your affair. Answer for your own sin." In an agony of repentance, the traitor threw the pieces of silver on the temple floor. Then he ran out of the temple to a lonely place outside the city. The chief priests picked up the pieces of silver. At this moment, even they felt some slight sense of shame. "It is not lawful for us to put this money into the treasury," they said, "because it is the price of blood." They therefore took counsel with each other, and after some discussion, they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field for the burial of penniless strangers. The ground they afterward purchased with the blood money has been called the Field of Blood to this very day. And because it was a potter's field, any piece of ground used as a graveyard for unknown persons or the very poor is still, today, known as a potter's field. The crowds, with Jesus in their midst, milled through the northern city gate, and Judas, in the lonely place, hanged himself upon a tree.